Today I'm going to be talking about the mystery and horror that I read in the first quarter of this year. It should be short and sweet since there were only 4 of them. Hello and welcome to my channel. My name is Kate if you are new here. And this is the final segment of my recent reads from quarter 1. I am finally getting caught up on this. And this is going to be focused on horror and mystery. There's a bit of a thriller component to this as well, but those are the main genres I'll be talking about. I'm also going to do this a little bit differently than I did my other recent reads from quarter 1. Instead of doing this by rating, I wanted to do this more by genre or sort of subgenre to make it a better transition, I think, between them, since I know not everybody who likes mystery likes horror and vice versa. So that'll make it easier for you to pick the section that's more interesting to you. I'm going to start with the mystery I read in the first quarter, and that is the second in the Thursday Murder Club by Richard Osman, which is The Man Who Died Twice. And I don't remember if I talked about the first book in the Thursday Murder Club, which I read at the end of last year, but I really loved the first entry in this series. It was super fun to follow this group of senior citizens who essentially all get together to solve cold cases because they don't want to join the puzzle club or like the crafting club. So they develop their own little group that is sort of they're very interfering busybodies, but they always have their hearts in the right place, even if they're engineering things the way they want them to be, which I thought was hilarious. But, you know, your mileage may vary on that. In this second book, one of the main members of the Thursday Murder Club, Elizabeth, is established in the first book to have a bit of a past with certain governmental organizations, and a figure from her past ends up coming to her for help. She has a fairly mixed relationship with this person, but she reluctantly agrees to help them out and ends up enlisting the help of the rest of the Thursday Murder Club. And honestly, I enjoyed this even more than the first one. I really love the way that The Man Who Died Twice expands on what you've already kind of grown to love about Thursday Murder Club. You really get to see more of the relationships between the different characters. There's a great exploration of mental health and specifically depression and dementia in this volume in a way that I found both heartbreaking and somewhat inspiring in this. I just really loved. It goes a bit deeper than you often see, where it's not just like someone's depression being instantly cured by having their friends around. So I thought it did a fantastic job with that, in exploring it without banging you over the head with it. So I just really liked that. I think this also maintains that cozy note that the first one had and really drives up the stakes a bit, because you really get to see a bit of Elizabeth's past in this one, and also kind of the shenanigans that she will get up to get to the bottom of something. I do appreciate that a lot of these characters are pretty nuanced, and none of them are like entirely goody two-shoes. They all have little pieces to them. So there gets to be a little bit of vigilante stuff in here. So, I mean, depending on your tolerance for that. But if you like cozy mysteries that have a bit of a standard like murder mystery twist to them that's a lot of fun, then you might really enjoy this one. I'll also say that you get to see a lot more of a side character from the first one who I absolutely loved, and I would highly recommend picking up the audiobook for this. The narration in that one is just brilliant, and it's particularly good because this side character is super fun to have the voice for. So I really enjoyed having the audio and could definitely see myself rereading it that way. I ended up giving this a 9.3 out of 10 or 5 stars. Transitioning now into horror, but sort of almost horror adjacent. I think this is more coming of age than it is strict horror, even though some of those elements are there. And that is Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones, which follows a young boy who is constantly living on the move as his aunt and uncle basically move them around the South to avoid being detected. Of course, his aunt and uncle are werewolves, and it is not clear yet if, I believe the main character is Darren, if he is going to inherit the same abilities as his aunt and uncle. So they're trying to raise him as well as trying to figure out where he's going to land. And honestly, Mongrels reminds me a lot of It by Stephen King, although much shorter, in terms of really diving into this coming of age type story and having the story really following the main character and his aunt and uncle and sort of the situations they end up in, the way that they're sort of living on the wrong side of the tracks and the way they interact with the communities that they pass through and sort of these, just how they live their day to day. So I think you have to enjoy sort of a slower pace and a much more character-driven type story. I think this is barely horror and really only in that your family is a family of werewolves. Otherwise, it is really more, like I said, a coming-of-age story that I think is brilliantly told, and I really love how intentional Stephen Graham Jones is with the language that he uses to write this. It's not flowery, but there's all these hints that he lays as he goes that I really appreciated as someone who is a bit of a language small details nerd. Honestly, I think I love this book more for the themes and the characters than for any of the speculative elements. I think it's an interesting exploration of sort of a life on the wrong side of the tracks via this werewolf lens. But it's just interesting to see Jones explore that, and I would definitely recommend it to anybody who finds that kind of story interesting. I ended up giving it 7.9 out of 10 or 4 stars. Now shifting more into horror, and both of the next two books that I'm going to talk about are in the realm of space horror. The first one is definitely space horror. I think the second one is probably more of like a sci-fi thriller, but it does have some horrific elements to it, which is what's leading me to put it in this category. So, unfortunately, the first of these two didn't work that well for me. And that's really unfortunate because this was a fairly hyped book, and I thought going in that I would love it because I do really love space horror. I'm a longtime fan of movies like The Thing, as done by John Carpenter. The other one's fine too, but I like the John Carpenter version best. I love I love some of the Alien movies. I also really enjoyed the Dead Space video game, and there's just something about these awful things in space happening that's very appealing to me. I don't know if it's like the isolated setting or just the idea of space being inherently dangerous that is appealing to me, but I just love that subgenre. The first book that I picked up in the first quarter of the year that fit in that subgenre was Dead Silence by S.A. Barnes. This is pitched as The Shining meets the Titanic because you're following a crew of people who have been repairing beacons along the kind of the edges of the known universe, but they are about to be replaced by robots, and so they're basically on their last mission. They end up running into this derelict ship that has been missing for years and decide to take a chance on salvaging it because it might mean securing their future since they're about to be phased out. As you might expect, jumping onto a derelict ship that's been missing for years does not go exactly as planned. So I think, unfortunately for me, Dead Silence suffers from the author clearly loving the genre tropes of space horror and sort of diving into that, but it was too predictable for me as someone who is also a fan of that. There are certain scenes that feel almost not word for word, but too similar to kind of these classic moments in space horror. And that just turned me off. There's one point in the story where I knew exactly what was going to happen because it was almost completely the same sequence as something I had seen in a TV show that I love. And I'm not going to say what it is because it would spoil it, but it was way too close, and so it took all the tension and the dread out for me because I knew what was going to happen. And I think the other detriment for me is having played the Dead Space video game, because there's too much similarity between the two of them. And I love the Dead Space video game, even though it scared the crap out of me when I played it. And it just felt like a rehash of some of the elements in that in a way that wasn't fun for me. About a third of the way into the book, I was actively rooting for awful things to happen because I didn't care about any of the characters and I wanted it to get exciting. So if that's what you want out of your horror, then I think this could be fun for you in a way that it wasn't for me. But my personal preference with horror is to have characters that I want to root for, and I just didn't care about anybody in here. One of the other elements that I really want out of a space horror is this building tension and dread. And this story kind of flips between a present day and then the timeline where things are actively happening on the ship. It takes away some of the tension and the dread for me. So I wasn't as wrapped up in the dread as I might have been if we had just had the ship timeline and then switched to the future at some point later. And sort of related to not really caring about the characters, the other thing that really didn't work for me is that there's a lot of conveniences that happen, particularly towards the end of the book, that just completely pulled me out of the story. There's a fairly strong romantic element that was tied into that just, for me, kind of sunk all interest in the book. And particularly in the ending. So overall, unfortunately, I just didn't connect to the characters. I felt like I'd seen a lot of these elements before and done in a way that worked better for me. I ended up giving this 4.3 out of 10 or 2.5 stars. And again, I think that part of this is a personal preference for me. So don't fully take my opinions on this. If you like kind of more standard horror where you don't care about the characters, or maybe you identify more with the characters than I did, I don't know. But your mileage may definitely vary with this. I know a ton of people who really love this book. It just unfortunately wasn't for me. The final one that I'm going to be talking about is Dead Space by Kelly Wallace. And I think there are definitely some parallels between Dead Space, the book, not the video game, and Dead Silence. But I think for me, Dead Space handles it better than Dead Silence does. I haven't decided yet if I want to do a full comparison between these and some other similar books, but I may be doing that at some point in the future. Dead Space follows a security consultant who ends up getting dragged into this murder mystery on a sort of mining station after the victim is a former colleague of hers. The main character in this book is someone who has experienced a ton of trauma and in fact has had parts of her body replaced by cybernetics. It has a very strong cyberpunk detective vibe to it, because there's sort of this human versus AI versus robot discussion that's happening in here that I thought was handled spectacularly well. In certain ways, this reminded me of the Murderbot series by Martha Wells because it is handling those themes. But this is a lot darker. And I think this is even more anti-corporate than anti-large corporations than Murderbot was. And it really delves into the ways that these large conglomerates can kind of sink their claws into people and not really allow them a ton of choices. And I thought that was a really interesting thematic exploration. I also really liked this on a murder mystery level. I will say that this is a much grimmer take than Murderbot. It does not have Murderbot's snarky humor. The main character, Hester Marley, has had to deal with a lot of trauma related to a terrorist attack. She's really struggling with the fact that she's now in sort of this dead-end job that she never expected to be in, and is dealing with a lot of physical pain and PTSD from what happened to her. And I thought that it did a really good job of having her be kind of prickly and unhappy with her life, but still being sympathetic in a way that worked better for me than the main character in Dead Silence, who suffered from some similar trauma. This also starts out with a pretty slow pace, as you kind of expect from a murder mystery, and then really accelerates into a thriller that has interesting implications. It does have a bit more of an open ending than you might expect from something like a thriller, so your mileage may vary as far as whether or not you find that acceptable. I know some people have gotten annoyed with it. I didn't mind it because I loved the themes, and I loved the way that Wallace described how the AI functioned and how some of these other robotic components functioned. It was just a really interesting exploration to me. So I wasn't as concerned about the way the plot wrapped up, but that may depend on your preferences. I definitely don't feel like Dead Space got the attention that it should have gotten. I don't think it was promoted very well, to be honest, and I don't think it found the right crowd. I think if you are a fan of cyberpunk type stories, you really want someone who has experienced a lot of trauma but is still sympathetic, and you want elements that are horrific, but it's not really a horror. There are some gruesome elements in this book, but it never gets quite to a horror, and so I felt like it straddled that line in a way that was really interesting to me, that I really loved seeing explored. I definitely want to pick up more from Callie Wallace in the future, because I think that Wallace's writing style works super well for me. So I am excited to see in some of the other books how she kind of explores that. And in particular, Salvation Day, which sounds like it might be more of a strict space horror, I'm super excited to get to. So that was the sort of small group of mystery and sort of thriller horror books that I ended up picking up in the first quarter of this year. In particular, if you have any space horror recommendations for me that are more in the realm of Dead Space in terms of tension and really sympathetic characters, I'd love to have more of those to check out. It's a subgenre that I've experienced a lot in media like movies and video games, but not as much in book format, so I'd love to get more of that. Let me know if you are interested in or have read any of these. Love to chat about that as always, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye!